what we'll be focusing on today is answering theory. Last time we focused on how to justify an interpretation. Today we're going to focus on how to take out an interpretation that is run against you. And to begin with some just kind of overview major points, you need to do as many things as you possibly can on the theory debate, because you need to have multiple ways to win the argument so you don't get screwed in the next speech. Because theory is something that if you don't handle it exactly right, you can lose just on it and nothing else matters. Right? So even if you're doing a great job winning your value criterion and your contention, if you're losing the theory debate, you're still going to lose the round. And so you need to not rely on just one or two arguments to win theory. You need to be doing as many things as possible to take it out. And then three kind of other major points. Individual drops are extremely important on theory. And so you need to be flowing extremely well and following the round very closely. This is more important than on if you're flowing someone's contention, because you've probably heard arguments like proportionality before. But theory debate in many cases is very nuanced and requires very good flowing skills. Second, doing drills is particularly crucial on theory because a lot of time it's decided by minor technicalities, and you're going to be making the same arguments a lot, between different rounds, so doing drills is particularly effective. And finally, you should prepare pre-written justifications for things that you know are going to be run against you. So if you're running proportionality and imminence NCs, you should pre-write a justification for necessary but insufficient burden theory and why they are good.
Alright, so those are some general strategies you can take when you're before the round, preparing to get into theory, a little bit in the round. But what are the specific arguments? So, firstly, are counter-interpretations. These are probably one of the most important ways to understand how to attack theory debate. Because there are some judges who think that you need to have a counter-interpretation or you're not going to win the theory debate. So, but if you're talking about, this sort of clarify things with an example. So say you're taking a test in class, and the teacher says that once the time's up, everyone has to put their pen down. So let's say the time happens, and you keep writing for a little bit. And the teacher goes to you and says, hey, you're breaking this rule. How might you try to explain yourself to the teacher and justify your actions? Yeah, I was just finishing one word. That's another way you might say it. You might be like, well, actually, you said put your pens down, but I was using a pencil, so I'm not technically breaking the rule. You might say I was writing my name on the test, so I'm not actually putting any information outside the time limits. I'm just making sure he knows who I am. What these examples sort of point to is that the way that oftentimes people debate about rules is just debating whether maybe two different rules, that one of them they break, one of them they don't. And using that as a way to try and win on the theory debate. So what a counter-interpretation does is sets up a different rule that you do not violate and says that that rule is preferable. But it's best to not just be generically, well, just insert a knot into your opponent's interpretation somewhere and just go from there. That's generally not a very strategic way of doing it because your opponent's probably thought about that being the counter-interpretation already, and is probably prepared for that debate. So what you try to do is be as specific as possible to co-opt the arguments and hijack them that were in the original step. So let's say, using an example from the demo debate, that literally reads to show that all alternatives must be sufficient for that. And you guys remember the times key standard. Do you remember what the argument there was? How about you have a guess?
That basically negatives would have to spend more time answering both burdens, whereas the affirmative only has to answer one.
And the important point being that the affirmative could just talk about one of those areas of debate in the one AR. It didn't validate that use of time. So let's say Brian's counter-interpretation was, instead of each debater may have one necessary decision burden, was that each debater may have one necessary but insufficient burden if they go for that argument in every speech, meaning that they couldn't just kick out of it and ignore one part of the debate. So in that situation, the specificity of the counter-interpretation solves for some of the harm and the bad consequences of breaking the original interpretation. Because that times speed argument would really be irrelevant, because the negative debater would never have their time speed because they know the affirmative has to go for and answer back their arguments about the burden on that level. Can someone explain back to me how that sort of counter-interpretation, that both debaters may have one necessary but insufficient burden if they go for it in every speech, solves for the time speed? Yeah.
It's responsive to her time skew argument. So like he would have to go for both arguments so that like he couldn't invalidate her time responding to both.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm gonna go for a question.
Do you want to tell me?
Kind of similar to be the
Okay, so on the counter-interpretation, just instead of a violation argument, you should say that you meet your counter-interpretation. This is normally fairly short, right? You say both debaters can run one necessary but insufficient standard if they go for it in every speech, and then just be like, B, I meet because that's what I'm going to do. Right? It's not that difficult. It's just kind of like you should always meet your counter-interpretation. So now let's get into counter-standards. What counter-standards are is they're exactly like the standards that we talked about in the first lecture. They're justifications for your interpretation, and they're reasons to prefer your interpretation over the others. And so they need to be unique offensive reasons for why your interpretation is good, right? So a counter-standard should not be, well, the time skew isn't that bad because I'm going to be going for it in every speech, right? That's just a reason why their standard would not be true, or would, like it's defense against their standard. Instead, you should say counter-standard is philosophical grounds, because I need to have the ability to access these types of philosophical literature like skepticism or like proportionality and immanence in order to like allow for education on philosophy, which is what LD is for, or in order to win rounds and link to fairness, right? So, and probably the most important thing on a counter standard is the link to the voter. And the reason why that is extremely important is because you can use that to weigh against other standards, right? So to continue the same example, if you're making a philosophical ground argument or philosophical literature as a justification for why you should be able to run necessary and insufficient burdens, you can weigh that against their time skew argument. I mean, like, sure, even I might be skewing a little bit of time, but if I don't have the ability to run these types of philosophical arguments, then I have no ability to win because I can't make any good arguments from the literature. Right? And so you're comparing not whether you are skewing time or not whether you are allowing for philosophical ground, but you're comparing which one of those two is more important in terms of fairness.
Yeah, so I think we also saw good examples of these in the demo debate the other day. Brian made arguments, and it's not only against the standards and Emily stuff, but also within his own, that the internal link between textuality and fairness is so strong that textuality is the most important theory standard because fair cases aren't fair on different topics, for example. So that's how you can use the internal link to the voter in order to make your counter standards more important. The other thing that you should always be doing when you're reading counter-interpretation is responding to their standards. Because those are still reasons why their interpretation is good, and you probably should respond to them. You can always, and then the same rules that apply to those, that would apply to a regular debate on a contention level, still apply in a theory debate. If you think of each standard like a contention argument, then the voters would like value. Then you can sort of see that, well, you probably need to respond to their standards. You probably should make turns, and you can. And if you can't, still put defensive arguments against them. Because, just like in a regular debate, if you both have the same sort of criterion or end goal, like fairness or something, you would need to respond to your opponent's contentions, try to outweigh them, make terms against them. The same rules apply here.
Just as a quick question, does everyone understand what we mean when we say the terms offense and defense against their standards? If you don't, it's completely fine. Everyone's good? Okay. All right. So, yeah, when you're responding to their standard, you want to be making both defensive arguments, which would take the form of, no, I'm not skewing time because I'm going to go for it in every single round. Right? That's just the reason why, like, neither one of you is skewing time in the debate round. So time skew really is becomes unimportant at that point. But you could also be putting offense against their standard, which, in the case of time skew, can't really think of any. But if you just gave a reason why, by not being able to run necessary but insufficient burdens, it skews the AFS client because they have to cover a negative case and an affirmative case, which becomes extremely difficult and they can't cover, or something like that. That's not a very good argument, but it does what, for the example, it does what it should do. And so that is not just the reason why neither one of you is skewing time. That's actually the reason why, in terms of time skew, you should be able to run necessary but insufficient burdens. So that's the reason why time skew would be a reason why your counterinterpretation is preferable. Does that make sense to everyone?
Okay. The other thing you can do when you're having this counterinterpretation debate is weigh between different voters and using yours to leverage those things. So, a lot of the times counterinterpretations might, you might have them linked to a different voter, such as a lot of the times, like John said, people defend necessary but insufficient burdens because that's how a lot of philosophical arguments take, and if you couldn't reach necessary but insufficient burdens, then that philosophy would be excluded from debate. So, you might try to leverage that type of education against their claims of fairness. So, an argument might be that fairness is only important like in terms of the round, but education is the ultimate like end goal of the debate. And that's the only lasting impact after we leave the debate round of what we've learned in there. So education is more important because it has long-lasting consequences. Now it could be an argument you make that would make all of your opponent's arguments irrelevant because they're all linking back to fairness, but your arguments link back to education, and education is more important than fairness.
And so one thing you should really be thinking about, and we're really trying to stress on you, is that theory debate is basically exactly like regular debate on the case, but you're just using different terms to refer to different things, right? Instead of a value, you have a voter, right? And when you debate on the case, you say, not only do I meet their voter or their value of justice and show I achieve justice, but I'm also meeting my value of morality and showing you why that is more important, right? So on theory, you want to be not only linking in to both voters, but also explaining why the one that you have better offense on, or your arguments are better on, is more important than the other one. And that's a way of integrating strategic thinking into the theory debate. Because when like all of their arguments only link to fairness or only link to education, if you have a bunch of arguments linked to the other one, then you can be ahead by just weighing between voters, right? Because there's no question that you're winning the who's more educational. And so if education precedes fairness, then you're going to win that theory debate.
All right. So that was all about how to have debate between counter-interpretations. Saw an example of that yesterday. There's still other ways to go about winning the theory debate. One of those that's sort of happened yesterday, but not quite, are called I-meet arguments. These are what people refer to as attacks against the violation on theory. So, an I-meet is just very similar to what it sounds like. is just saying, I don't actually break the rule contained in the interpretation. So, like if your teacher said, everyone has to put their pens down at the end of the test, and then got really angry at you for not putting a pen down, if you're just like, but I didn't do it. Like I didn't break after the test was over. Then you wouldn't have broken the rule, and you would be fine. And the ways that you can make IDs is usually using the vagueness of the interpretation. Like a lot of the times, for like say, your opponent claims you read a pre-standards argument, something that like definitionally proves resolution true. And then they're like, well, pre-standard arguments are bad. And you're like, well, actually, I meet the interpretation. My argument is linking back to a standard. It's linking back to the standard of proof, or something like that. That would be an explanation of how you are meeting the interpretation, because they weren't specific enough in what they were talking about. They weren't specific enough in what they were talking about.
So one example of this came from the other demo debate that I debated yesterday. I had what was probably a necessary but insufficient burden in the EAC, and Amin ran theory on it. And my response was that, no, it's not a necessary but insufficient burden, because he just has to do two things, but there's two things that he has to do to prove that there was a prohibition, which is really only one burden, right? So just because he has to do two things, it's still only one burden he has to achieve, right? Which is, although it's kind of just like moving words around, and it seems kind of like shady to be saying stuff like that, on the theory debate, arguments like that are true and can be used very strategically on the I-meet level, because theory debate, especially on the interpretation level, is all about just like whether you're meaning the exact text of the phrase, right? So if you can show that their interpretation is written badly, and you can kind of maneuver your advocacy in such a way where you can meet their interpretation, then the theory debate basically goes away, because it's meaningless, right? To see whether a rule is good that both of you are consistent with. It just doesn't matter. Yeah?
So if it's one standard or one burden, like proportionality on the neg, and they give multiple qualifiers, like meet this, to be proportional, that's not a necessary burden because it's still one burden.
Well, it's debatable whether it's a necessary or insufficient burden.
Okay.
But Amin's interpretation was both sides must link all offense to one necessary and sufficient standard, right? See, in that case, it would meet the interpretation because your arguments are still linking into the one necessary and sufficient standard, which is like showing a prohibition or proving the action permissible. Right? Yeah.
And in CX, would you question about that to clarify whether, or what strategy to not ask them about that in CX?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Especially on like I-meets and violations, you should always be using CX very strongly and very effectively, because if you're trying to set up and run theory against someone else, you want to make the violation extremely clear. And one way to do that is in cross-examination. Right? So when like Amin was questioning me, he was asking me, okay, so I have to do two things in order to win, and I was like, yes, that's what you have to do. You're both linked to a higher standard, right? And so like when you're trying to run theory against someone, you want to use cross-examination to get violations, and when you're might be or are having theory run against you, before you get theory run against you, you should see it coming and kind of not answer the questions unless they specifically ask you for it, right? Don't lie if they ask you like, is this the function of a particular argument, right? But if they don't ask you really specifically, don't tell them it's a necessary but insufficient burden, right? Like make them ask you. So don't just like give them theory links. But after they already have run theory against you, you want to clarify what their interpretation is and clarify the exact specific wording of it, so you can kind of maneuver and exploit ambiguities and mistakes in the way they wrote it.
Yeah. So you should not lie about your position. in cross-examination. They're trying to get you to like give them some sort of theory link. But you don't have to tell them the truth that they're not asking for. So if their questions are like, just not phrased very well, it is fine to just answer their question and not volunteer the additional information they're trying to get you to say.
One thing that you want to be careful of in cross-examination is that judges are fairly perceptive of if you're trying to avoid questions in CX. Right? So if you're just like clearly being really shady and not answering anything that has to do about your abusive position, right? Then that's just going to make them think that you're being abusive in cross-examination, right? So like the biggest thing you need to be doing in cross-examination is just make yourself sound really reasonable and like you're not actually being that bad. And and one way to do that is just kind of like answer questions and be like, no, I'm not actually being abusive. Let me explain why this is really simple, or something like that. Try and be calm and reasonable when talking about theory.
One thing some people do a lot that I think is particularly annoying is that they'll sort of just like play dumb, and if you ask them like the jargon phrase for something, like isn't this a freestanding argument, or isn't this a necessary but insufficient burden, then they go and be like, well, what is a necessary but insufficient burden? I've never heard of this before. When obviously that's blatantly false. They're clearly running like 7 necessary but insufficient burdens. They know exactly what they're doing. In that situation, I find that that's just like fairly obnoxious. And if they really don't think the necessary but insufficient burdens, and if they have a defense of it, they should just say, no, I'm not running them, and not just play dumb when obviously that's false.
All right. Okay, so remember on the last lecture when we talked about when you're running theory, how you should be giving reasons why you should not only just like cross particular arguments off the flow and not vote on imminence or proportionality, but that you should reject the debater and just vote them down immediately before you even look at the case. Right? Y'all remember that?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you're answering theory and someone is saying you should lose before anything else, only off the theory debate, that's probably something you should respond to, right? Because you shouldn't take the risk of losing an argument or two or dropping an argument on theory and then you're done, right? You lose. So you want to be giving reasons why they, off of theory, they should reject the argument, not the debate.
Yeah. This didn't happen in the demo round. So, given Brian's strategy in the 1 hour, why might it have been somewhat strange if you just made the argument, reject the argument, not the debater? Meaning, the judge would just throw out the DAC because it was necessary for insufficient burden and just ignore that, but not vote him down on it. So, given Brian's strategy in the 1 hour, why might it have been strange for him to go for an argument that he should just throw away the AC, the necessary but insufficient burden, and not vote him down, even if Emily wins the theory? Kai. Do you have a guess? So given Brian's strategy in the 1 hour, why might it have not been strategic or very strange if he went for the argument, just throw out the necessary and insufficient burden, don't vote me down for it? So if Brian had won that argument, and Emily had won her theory show, and the judge just ignored the affirmative case, how could they vote for Brian?
This is how interpretation and one should have one necessary burden.
I'm sorry, I couldn't agree with it.
Yeah.
It is our interpretation about how everyone can have one necessary but insufficient burden. Is that it?
Yep, sounds like our interpretation.
If he did say, like, okay, reject the AC, but I want my counter interpretation, then he would make his own counter interpretation that we all could have one.
wouldn't reject the AC if Brian won his counter interpretation. Then the AC is fair.
But even then, don't you need the whole like fairness argument at the top that justifies the winning theory? Like if you throw it out, then you don't have the fairness argument in this theory.
Well, the theory wasn't being run against that spike at the top of the AC. The theory was being run against the burden of the AC, so that's what the judge would be throwing at.
But wasn't Brian or didn't Emily try and be like, oh, well, like look, he says we have to be fair, so let's be fair.
I don't think that's right. So, Brian are entirely on the theory case. Brian spent no time extending the AC, no time being like, well, the resolution is also still true. Yeah.
Because like he wanted, well, if he didn't really want to extend the AC because he wanted to win off of like a better counter interp.
Yeah. Brian thought that his time, if he had split his time between winning theory and going for the AC, that he just wouldn't be able to cover both of those debates. Which is a situation that a lot of people, especially for urban debaters in the 1AR, face a choice where if they try to answer back the theory debate and win the substantive debate, they're just going to make not very good arguments on both of those, and the negative is just going to collapse to one of them. So, but if Brian had gone for the argument, reject the argument, not the debater, it seems like he was still immediately lost, even if Emily won the theory shell, because Brian had no substantive arguments for why the resolution was still true. So while making the argument, reject the argument, not the debater, is an important one and is oftentimes very strategic because if the judge just throws up the argument and then you have other like terms or something against your opponent's case, then you can still win the round that way. But it's important to note when it's strategic and when it's not strategic. And yesterday we talked about arguments of why we should have fairness or education be a voting issue, and that it deters people. So, what might be an argument for why it's better to just throw out the argument that was unfair and just let the rest of the debate run?
Can you repeat that?
What might be a justification for why you should reject the argument, not the debate?
In response to the deterrence argument that we talked about yesterday. How about when you guys are doing that? So, next to Andy. How about guy in the blue shirt? So, what might be a justification for why you should reject the argument, not the debate?
One justification might be that the purpose of theory is to establish what is a good and bad rule in debate, and if you reject the debater, then the round is over and they can't continue debating to fulfill the voters of education fairness you gave a minute ago. So you drop the argument, so we can see it's unfair, but you still let me debate how it's fair shot at winning, because that would not violate the same voters you gave a minute ago.
Okay. Yeah, that's a reasonable argument that if you just reject the argument, you can still have an education debate and continue it. The rest of the debate is now going to be fair, and the rest of it is now going to be educational. Yeah, you have another argument?
Yeah, I would say that losing the argument is plenty disincentive because people aren't going to run arguments that they know are going to be dropped because they will have wasted their time reading the argument. And also, if you reject the debater all the time, then it's going to disincentive running novel arguments or interesting arguments, and so prevents debate from developing as an activity.
Yeah, I think those are two other good arguments. That the important part that I like about the first one is the reference to time. I think it's probably one of the more common arguments why you should reject the argument after debate, which is just that the time lost by someone throwing out the argument, like Ryan might say, well, I spent I guess the theory spike was independent of it, but Ryan might say, I spent 5 minutes and 30 seconds of the affirmative case, justifying the necessary evidence mission burden, and then meeting it. So if you throw out all those arguments, that's a significant loss to me, because I just lost the entire AC. In that situation, you might say that the unfairness created by the necessary evidence mission burden has been rectified because the act lost the affirmative case. In that situation, you wouldn't vote them down. You would just remove the AC and the round would continue from there, based on whatever negative case the analytic decided for.
And so the way you should be structuring these reject the argument, not the debater. Like a lot of the arguments that we've been going over so far is just kind of reasons why reject the argument is sufficient punishment. You should couple these with arguments for why rejecting the debater would be far too strong a punishment. So just be like, well, I might be a little bit unfair, and they're calling me out on that, but that doesn't mean I should get the death penalty because it's still possible to have a legitimate ground from this point forward, right? There's no reason why we can't proceed in a way, like if these arguments are gone, there's no reason why we can't proceed in a fair or educational debate. And so there's no reason why I should be completely excluded from the round and lose. Yes?
And in the structure of the theory debate, you'd present, reject, or drop the argument of the debater, not preemptively, because that would look like they're already being abusive, but in response to a counter-term?
I think that's probably the right way to go,
Okay.
just from a perceptual standpoint, because normally if judges think you're being abusive, it's going to be harder for you to win the theory debate, and having a bunch of theory spikes in the AC kind of shows that you think you're being abusive, and you just kind of want to be tricky and get out of it, right? So I would say you should wait until the 1AR. But if there are some debaters this past year that everyone knew were just horribly abusive, and people would run theory against them every single round, and the judges knew that too, so they would just have spikes in there and just beat people by being really good technically.
Yeah, but a lot of the times, really quick before we get to your question, so a lot of the time, people might not really notice what it is that your case is doing. Like Brian's case was sort of explicit, like I can do one of two things to win, the negative has to be both of these. But sometimes it's not very clear that like what your case is doing. That might be theoretically objectionable. Like if you have so you have like a regular case, but the last argument in the case is offense that doesn't really factor standard, but just like definitionally proves the resolution true. That argument functions whole entirely separately from the rest of the AC. Well, a lot of the times, because it's at the bottom of the case and people probably aren't really paying that much attention to it there, they might miss the argument. But if you have a theory argument, like theory spike in the case, like what Brian had at the top of the AC, this is a generic reason why like fairness is not a voter, then your opponent's probably going to key and be like, there's probably a reason he's making this argument, so there's probably something fishy going on with this AC. So then they would probably pay even more attention to your case. But if you just didn't make that argument and saved your responses for the 1AR, the negative debater probably might not even notice that argument's there, and then they wouldn't run theory on it, and you can get the advantage of adding its definitional proof to the resolution.
My question was, like, perceptually, as you said, running drop the debater, or drop the argument of the debater is obviously bad because it already concedes that you may lose theory. But would running predictive theory spikes that education is the voter, theory, or fairness is the voter, would that look better to the judge than running predictive drop the argument voters?
Most judges kind of have the, I don't know about most, but some judges, a good number of judges, I'll stick to that, kind of just accept that fairness and education are voters, and will not accept responses to it. And then there's an even larger subset of judges that just think that all reasons why fairness and education are not voters are really bad. If you win them, they'll probably vote on them, but they'll accept very little or small answers to them. So just generally, arguments about why fairness or why education are not voters is not the way to answer a theory shell, because it's extremely difficult to win those arguments. And reject the argument, not the debater, is not conceding you're losing theory, right? It's just like, well, even if I'm losing theory, I shouldn't lose on it, right? You shouldn't only be making reject the argument, not the debater arguments. You should be coupling them with a counterinterpretation, with I meet arguments, with turns and responses to their standard, and then make reject the argument, not the debater arguments.
And you'd only claim that you should reject the argument, not the debater, if you can still win if they just threw out the argument and like you had some turns somewhere else in the flow. So judges are going to be aware that, oh, they're making this argument not because they think that they're being abusive and they just don't want to deal with it, but because they think that it's more strategic for them to go for like case level arguments and just try to make theory be irrelevant. Yeah.
So the last way of, the last like, general way to answer a theory shell is called a reverse voting issue, or an RVI. And what that means is that if you win either your counter interpretation or an I meet, depending on what you're justifying, you win the round. Right? So what this argument is that so they can win off theory if they win their interpretation. So I should be able to win off theory if I win my counter interpretation. And the reason why this is particularly strong, and the reason why this argument is particularly good and useful to have in your arsenal, is you can do what Brian did, right? And go all in on theory, and then if you win theory, you win, right? You don't have to go for the AC, or you don't have to go for the NC. If you win why necessary but insufficient burdens are good, then you win the round.
Yeah, so there are a couple of different ways to justify RVIs. We talked about two of them yesterday. So one of them was the argument not made in the demo round. It was one that I talked about during the moderation talk. Does anyone remember what that argument was? It had to do with necessary but insufficient burdens, not particularly to the theory. Does anyone have a guess what it might be? Okay, well, it was last night.
Oh, was it the time-scale argument, which says I have to go all in on the 1AR for theory, so it becomes an RVI if I win theory?
So because the affirmative spend all of their time answering an argument, they should win because they answered the argument?
Well, you could say the negative running theory has forced me to run theory, and the time speed already on the medic side. So now I have to answer 6 minutes of like the NC and the theory and the extension. But theory proceeds also. I'm forced to run theory for 4 minutes, and because of this, if I win theory, I win the round.
That was the argument that I was thinking of, but that is definitely an argument for why theory should be a reverse voting issue. That it takes so much time to answer theory because you have to do a lot of like technical things like reading counter interpretation, making counter standards, whatever. That because it takes so much time to answer it and it sucks up so much time, particularly in the 1AR, that it should be a voting issue for you because there's no way you could do that and win on a substantive debate in any sort of clear, decisive manner. So that's one good argument why RVIs are good. The other one was that theory shouldn't itself be a necessary but insufficient burden for the exact reasons that Emily explained in her theory show. That if you can't win on theory, that means you have to answer theory, but you can't win there, and then win case level arguments. So it's not just that it takes you a lot of time, like his argument was, theory, that's why it should be a voting issue, but particularly because theory becomes a necessary but insufficient burden.
Another argument that can justify an RPI is in response to like a lot of people just running like short theory shells that are pretty bad just to kind of serve as a time suck. You can say that an RVI checks bad theory, that it disincentivizes people from running just short, lippy shells that don't actually justify anything, just to make you respond to them in the 1AR, to waste a bunch of your time, right? And so the advantage of having an RVI, or what the RVI does, is it causes people to stop running bad shells in the first negative speech, because they're afraid that they're going to lose off of it if they lose the theory arguments later on in the round. Right? Does that make sense to everyone? So who can explain to me why checking bad theory would be a good thing? Yeah.
I guess educational-wise, like, interestingly, like, better because overall people aren't going to run like crappy, just like short theory shells to just get a quick one off. I guess it's like a reason to vote because it was like a pretty educational like aspects of it.
Yeah. What I particularly like about his answer is that he says it's not good to just be debating about theory all the time. It's not educational for us to talk about some ridiculous interpretation every single round. Instead, we should try and force the debate onto substance or onto the case, and by using RBIs, you can do that.
So the final argument that was made in the demo round was that while theory sort of necessarily must justify an RBI, because it works with the voter that you vote for the data with better. That particular argument, though, is sort of different from the other ones. Does anyone want to take a guess as to why the argument made in the demo round might be different from the other arguments justifying an RBI, specifically in terms of what you have to do in order to win the theory debate? So, one argument is that theory presumes an RBI because if you win an interpretation that is more fair than your opponent, that says the voter says you should win because you're endorsing better debate. The other arguments say that I've spent a lot of time answering theory. This means that it has to be voting in for me because I couldn't win elsewhere on the flow. Theory should be necessary to inscription burden, something like that.
So what's the difference between these two arguments in terms of how they're framing the theory debate? This is a pretty complicated question, but.
So from what I understand, the first one would be like, okay, if I win my interpretation, then that should be enough for me to affirm, or for me to win. The second one is like, even if I do like a crappy job, like I've had to spend all of my time just answering this stuff, which isn't fair. So it should be a voting issue that even if I don't necessarily win it all the way, I should still get preference on the ballot.
Well, what you said about the first one is definitely true. And what the first one is saying is that the judge's obligation is to vote for the better interpretation. So if I win mine, then I should win. Right? But on the second one, what the RBI, like, it's not just to say, well, if I'm not doing a very good job running theory, you should vote for me. Right? What the RBI is saying is that if I am decisively winning theory, right, I'm winning that my counter-interpretation is better. Right? It is more fair and more educational. Then I should win because running bad theory shells or running our theory should not be a necessary but insufficient burden, so I should also have utility to win off. Right? The RBI is not to say that if I'm not winning theory, then I should win. It's to say if I'm winning theory, then theory should be a way for me to win as well as a way for them to win. Does that make sense to everyone? So you cannot lose a counterinterpretation and win on the RBI. The RBI only comes about if you are winning your counterinterpretation. Yeah?
So the only way though, or like one of the ways that the RBI was justified in the round, namely that it'd be paradoxical for her to claim nibs are bad and then make theory an unnecessary insufficient burden, that only happened because of the nature of the theory argument. So you can't like point that out in every theory argument, right? Only because of the nature of what's going on.
Well, it's certainly easier when they're running theory unnecessary insufficient burdens, right? But you can still make the kind of generic theory should be a two-way street. If they can win off of it but I can't, then that's unfair because it's just like I have to both win theory and substance, but they can go for either one, right? You can give a fairly short explanation of why necessary but insufficient burdens are bad, particularly in terms of why theory is a necessary but insufficient burden, even if their original interpretation was on something completely different.
But the distinction that we're sort of looking for that is like a very somewhat complicated distinction is that with one of the arguments being that I spend a lot of time justifying theory, so I should be able to win the round off. That doesn't necessarily imply that you have to win a counter interpretation. It just says if I'm winning the theory debate, or not losing on the theory debate, then I should win the round. So, some people, and some ways of justifying RBIs, would mean that if you make an I meet argument, which is ordinarily just defensive, I'm not breaking this rule, so it's fine. But if that's paired with an argument that if I'm not losing on theory, you should vote them down because they've wasted their time, like prevented educational debate on the substantive issues of the topic, by reading this theory argument, then I should win. So, usually I meets are not offense, but sometimes you can pair them with particular justifications for an RBI that makes them offensive. So, can someone explain back to me how you might make an I meet into an offensive argument? Yeah.
You could say, like, you could kind of use the I meet in the beginning as like a defense saying, I didn't break the rule. And then you could say, but now I've had to waste all this time saying why I didn't break the rule and we wasted time on theory, which prevented a substantive debate on the actual resolution and the actual debate content, which means that you should vote them down because we didn't get to really have an educational debate.
Yeah, they harmed education by reading this theory shell and didn't violate. Therefore, vote them down.
And so the difference between these two RBI arguments is that the first one that came up in the demo round presumes that the judge's obligation is to simply to vote for the best interpretation. Right? Whichever the interpretation or the counter-interpretation, whichever one is best, they should vote for. Right? Whereas the other argument simply says the judge's obligation is to vote and rectify violations of education or fairness, right? So essentially, what you're saying in the second RBI argument was that running theory violated education or fairness, so they should be voted down, right? It's not that my interpretation is better, so you should vote for me, or it's not vote for me because I am being fair. What the argument is saying is that their running of theory that either I meet or I am beating was unfair, was a violation of education or fairness, so you should vote for me. Does everyone understand that distinction? Because that's extremely important. So who can, yeah.
My question is why, can you explain to me again why he was allowed to kick out of his theory spike, which says fairness doesn't matter, and then went back into fairness and said, yeah, hey, never mind, it's cool, and not fair.
So that was particularly for the demo round, and that's, well, so just because you make an argument with the AC doesn't mean you have to go for it in normal AI. Like, if you make a generic spike that takes out negative cases, like you say, deadly force might not kill people, therefore, affirm the resolution doesn't violate deontology. Because they're not necessarily killing someone. If the exact answer is an argument and still read the deontology case, you don't have to go for that particular argument that takes it out. You could just say, oh, okay, maybe I do violate deontology, but deontology should refer my stand. So just like in any regular debate, you don't have to go for all the arguments made, even if they're clear.
So can someone explain to me the difference between the two RBI arguments, being I'm winning my counter-interpretation, so vote for me, and theory is a time suck, and I should have the ability to win out the grid because they can have the ability to win out. Yeah.
Okay, so the first RBI that says my counter interpretation should be preferred, that's like that's an RBI, and you should win off of that because it proves that what you're doing is actually like beneficial in some way to debate. And then the second RBI that says bad theory or theory shells that you don't violate are a time suck. That says like you spent your entire like AR answering this theory shell that I didn't violate. Thus, you should vote me up to deter people from using bad theory shells in the MC or whatever.
Yeah, that's a very good explanation of what the two arguments are. Can you explain the difference between the two of them in terms of like what the judge is voting on?
Okay, what the judge votes on in the first RBI that says your counter interpretation is preferable is like it just says what your arguments are, or like the necessary but insufficient burdens aren't like that bad or are good or beneficial in some way. and then what the judge votes on in the second RBI is just like time skew and says my AR was filled with theory shell, so vote me up because I spent all my time on that, and bad theory shells are time suck.
Yeah, exactly. The first shell, or the first RBI rather, is saying the judge should vote for the better interpretation. I have the better interpretation, so vote for me. Right? And the second one is saying their running of theory, which I proved false, is unfair because it was just wasting my time and screwing my time.
And then very briefly, because we're sort of running out of time, RBI, so there are also arguments why theory should not be reversed by RBI. This is what I said in the daily debate yesterday that you all should write down. RBI equals reverse voting. Reasons why theory is not an RBI. I believe I talked about this briefly yesterday. So, like in a game of basketball, if on one point one team didn't foul someone, they wouldn't be like, aha, we followed the rules, therefore we win the game. And then just like walk off the court after someone scores a point and then they foul it. Basketball would be a very boring game if that was the case. No one would ever do it. So, that's an argument people make that just following the rules doesn't mean you can win. What does this argument not do, though, that the other arguments about RBIs did do that? The other arguments being reason why RBIs did. Okay, do you have an idea?
What was your question?
So, the argument that theory should not be an RBI is that following a rule doesn't mean you should win. But why is how is that different from the other argument we was talking about why theory should be an RBI? Yeah, the important distinction is that this argument doesn't really make an appeal that like it's actually it is more fair to not have theory be reverse voting. This is just like gives an example, talks about some sports. It doesn't really link these arguments back to some sort of conception of fairness or education. The other arguments do. They perhaps are establishing a rule that if your opponent calls you out for breaking the rule, and you don't, then you should win. So I think that distinction there is sort of indicative of. But this argument, while it might make intuitive sense, doesn't really provide a lot of ways to justify an RBI, just by saying why RBIs are bad. Probably the better argument would be that RBIs incentivize good theory debate, or they incentivize good theory debaters being abusive, and then having people, if people run theory against them, they just win on the RBI.
So, like if you're Brian and you're really good at theory, you can be really abusive and run necessary and insufficient burdens in the AC, and then when they run theory, just beat them on theory and win. Right? So it incentivizes people to be abusive, which is bad. Mm-hmm. And so, as a bonus question, who can explain to me why, I'll phrase it abstractly first of all. Who can explain to me, or who can give me an argument that you should not run in conjunction with RBIs that we've talked about in today's lecture? Yes?
Drop the argument of the debater.
Why not?
Because you want to punish the other debater for if you're apt and they're running a theory on you for taking up your time, for doing bad things. You don't want them to just say, yeah, let the argument pass because you want to punish them for that, because now you don't have any time to extend the argument in the first place.
Okay, if you run theory and someone runs reject the argument, not the debater, and an RBI against you, what does that open you up to be able to do? Yeah?
Say that you should just reject their theory, like not vote on one, or reject their argument.
Or it would be reject your theory shell, right? So there are RBI arguments saying your theory argument is unfair. And so just be like, okay, my theory argument's unfair, but you reject the argument, not the debater. Reject my theory shell, it goes away. Now let's go to substance. And then they have 6 minutes to do a very good job winning the substance debate, and you lose.
So very briefly, wrapping up. So we've talked a lot about ways to answer theory. A lot of these stories are very complicated, but really the best way to get better at theory, or if you're afraid theory is going to be run against you, is just to initiate the debate yourself. Even if you don't know quite how to write a shell, or you think there's something wrong with your shell, judges who listen to theory and like theory care a lot that people understand how it's run. So even if they might get angry at you for like not reading the theory shell in the correct form because you do something weird or something, they'll tell you what it is you're doing wrong, and you can learn from that. I never read theory for the first 3 years of my debate career. I was just like, fairness, it doesn't matter that much. You just answer my arguments. I lost a lot of debates on theory those years. But before my senior year at camp, I just ran theory every single practice round. Because if you just run the arguments a lot, you just get a lot better at debating it. So even if you don't plan on initiating theory debates like during the year when you're actually debating, you'll get a lot better at responding to theory if you know what it takes in order to beat someone on the theory debate. And when your opponent makes responses to your shells, you'll be able to tell when those are bad responses and find what good responses are. The other thing you can do, if you're afraid of theory being run against you, is just to have like maybe 1 or 2 rounds, just read like 7 theory shells. Even if you lose that debate, that's like probably a pretty interesting round. When your opponent like go around and be like, hey, did you hear about that random person from Nebraska who had 7 theory shells against me? So, then if someone hears that you did that, they probably won't be abusive to you. So a lot of times what debaters do, if they're hitting someone who they know is bad at theory, is they just be abusive towards them. They'll run an unnecessary bit of switch and burden against you, they'll run a standards argument or something, because they think that you're not good at theory. But if they hear that in one round, even if you lost that round, that you ran 7 theory shells, they're going to be like, oh shit, this person doesn't know what they're doing. And then they'll have a regular debate with you. So the other benefit of sort of having a reputation of running theory a lot is that people just won't be abusive to you, so you won't have to run theory as much. So if you really don't like theory debate, it's still important to get good at it. Throw a shit ton of shells at someone one round, and be like, aha, I have this reputation of being that guy. We'll run 7 theory shells.
You do not want to be like I was, where I just never ran theory on people, and so people first of all thought I was bad at it and would run it against me all the time. And then second of all, people would just like abuse the hell out of me because they would think, oh, it's Heiselman, he's not going to run theory, and then they would run like 8 necessary insufficient programs, right? Which was difficult to respond to because I, for some reason, never liked running theory. So you should run theory, don't be afraid to do it, and the more you run it, the better you'll get at it, and theory is an extremely important skill, right? The 2 kids in finals of TOC this year were the 2 best theory debaters in the country. They ran theory like every out round at TOC, and they won off of it every single time. And so if you're good at theory, you can be extremely good at debate. It's an extremely important skill. I think that's it, right?
All right. Yep, so this has been the theory lecture. Andy seems to want us to stop talking.